Hey everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. If you are new here, my name is Sian and I love making content about anything creepy, disturbing, cult, that sort of thing. So if you love that kind of stuff, then you're definitely in the right place. I hope that everyone had an amazing Christmas and a very, very fun New Year's, and I hope that you've all arrived safely back at home. If you did anything fun for the holidays, please let me know what you did. I would love to hear how much fun you had. I just went to the Eastern Cape, a place in South Africa, and we basically just had some fun on the beach, but I have been working this week, so I didn't have a very long holiday, but I do have another holiday coming up in January now, in like 2 weeks. We're going to Dubai for 2 weeks for a wedding. I didn't have a very long break over the Christmas period, so I'm very excited to have that 2-week break. But anyways, today I have a very exciting video planned for us. I have been wanting to do this cold case for a while. Odds are you probably have heard of it already, but that doesn't take away from how interesting it is. But let's get right to it. On the morning of March 17th, 2000, the quiet hills of southwestern Uganda became the site of one of the deadliest massacres in history. A deadly fire consumed a small church, taking the lives of more than 300 people that were followers of a cult group. As investigators combed through the ashes and began to search the property, they made a really shocking discovery. Hundreds more bodies were buried in mass graves across the property and in nearby properties. Poisonings, strangulations, and other horrifying signs pointed at a far darker truth. Was this a mass suicide, or was it something far more sinister? This is a story of a religious movement born out of visions of the Virgin Mary herself. A group that began in 1989 under the leadership of Credonia Morinda, a former bartender and sex worker, as well as Joseph Kibwetera. I really hope I'm not butchering those names, but I probably am. To their followers, they promised salvation, strict adherence to the 10 Commandments, and an escape from the end of the world. But instead of all of this, they led their followers into one of the most tragic mass deaths of the 21st century. So who were these leaders, and what drove hundreds of people to their deaths? And what really happened on that fateful day in March of 2000? Let's take a deep dive into a cult called the Movement for the Restoration of the 10 Commandments of God. So let's speak a little bit about the background and history and how this cult formed originally. So the Movement for the Restoration of the 10 Commandments of God, which is quite a mouthful, didn't form in a vacuum. And what I mean by that is that it didn't just form out of nowhere because the person had an idea and they wanted to form a cult. There were a lot of events and a lot of things that happened in Ugandan history that made sense for someone to form a religious group like this, and we're going to speak a little bit about that now. So by the late 1980s, Uganda was a country struggling to recover from years of political and social chaos. The rule of Idi Amin in the 1970s, followed by the Ugandan Bush War and the devastating AIDS pandemic, left the whole population of Uganda traumatized and desperate for hope. During this time, Uganda had one of the highest rates of HIV and AIDS infection in the world, further fueling this sense of despair. Traditional institutions, including the Roman Catholic Church, were faltering under the weight of scandals and waning public trust. In this void, many turned to alternative religious movements, often led by very charismatic figures claiming to offer divine guidance and salvation from all of the nonsense that was happening at the time. And obviously this led to the beginning of, I'm gonna try and abbreviate it, I think it's MRTCG. Okay, so we're just gonna call it that. Anyways, so it was in this climate of uncertainty and spiritual yearning that Credonia Morinda and Joseph Kibwetera stepped onto the scene. So both Morinda and Kibwetera claimed to have experienced visions of the Virgin Mary herself. The messages that they received were apocalyptic in nature, and basically what they said was the world was on the brink of destruction and salvation could only be achieved by strict adherence to the 10 Commandments. So in 1989, the two met and founded the MRTCG. They declared that their mission was to spread the word of the Virgin Mary's message and prepare their followers for the end of the world. Shortly after the start of this movement, word of Kibwetera and his religion spread across southwest Uganda and beyond. The community was by no means closed off from the rest of society, and several people in positions of authority, including policemen and government officials, were aware of its activities. but very little action was actually taken against the cult before that huge event where so many people died. The origins of the movement, however, stretched back further. Credonia's father, Paulo Koshaku, had claimed to receive divine visions as early as the 1960s. His experiences, which include a vision of his deceased daughter, Evangelista, was said to have foretold Credonia's own encounters with the Virgin Mary. Under her father Koshaku's guidance, Credonia began her mission, meeting with Kibutera and convincing him to join her cause. Together they formed the partnership that would attract thousands and thousands of followers. So the movement grew very quickly, fueled by both of its leaders' charisma and the promise of salvation in such uncertain times. Defrocked Catholic priests and nuns, disillusioned with the church, joined their ranks, lending theological legitimacy to the group's teachings. Among these was Dominic Katarababo, a respected priest with a PhD from the United States, whose reputation helped draw a lot more members to the cause. So the group was deeply apocalyptic, emphasizing Marian apparitions and the urgency of preparing for the end of the world. Members were required to give up all of their possessions, live communally, and follow a very strict lifestyle that included a near total silence to avoid committing any sins through speech. All of the members wore matching uniforms, worked on self-sustaining farms, and only communicated through hand signs. Over time, the movement established a thriving community in the Kanungu district, and the community was primarily funded through pooling members' assets and selling their belongings. While the group expanded, it did often clash with local communities and authorities. In 1993, before they relocated to Kanungu, they were actually expelled from an area called Rawashame by the village elders, which forced them to found their community in the Kanungu district. And it was in this district that Credonia's father offered the MRTCG land to start off their community. Despite lots of setbacks, including a measles outbreak which caused them to close all of their schools, the movement continued to grow. By 1997, its membership had swelled to nearly 5,000 people, according to government filings. Throughout the 1990s, the group's leaders maintained control by leveraging their claimed divine communication. Credonia insisted that she received messages from the Virgin Mary through a hidden telephone that spoke through everyday objects. This very mystical connection added an aura of both mystery and authority, convincing followers to obey her without question. I think by that point, I would have been out of there. I mean, you're telling me that this divine being is just communicating and speaking through everyday objects. If she has the power to do that, why doesn't she just speak to everyone? So in the cult, the leaders preached that the world was going to end in the last day of December of 1999. So as the year 2000 approached, all of the preparations for the apocalypse completely intensified. Followers sold their possessions and adhered very strictly to the group's teachings, believing that the end was imminent. In 1999, a teenage member very confidently even told a newspaper that the world ends next year. There is no time to waste, his leaders speak directly to God, and any minute now, when the end comes, every believer will be saved. In hindsight, all of these beliefs set the stage for one of the most tragic events in Uganda's history. So now I'm just going to go into detail a little bit about the group's beliefs and practices. So like I mentioned before, the MRTCG built its teachings on a single foundation: very strict obedience to the 10 Commandments. For the group, these laws weren't just moral guidelines, this was literally the key to survival in the apocalypse. To disobey the commandments was to risk eternal damnation, and this unwavering belief was the thing that shaped every aspect of the movement's daily life. Like I said before, the group was actually completely silent and they would only communicate using hand signs, and the emphasis on the commandments was so intense that members were discouraged from talking. The leaders all feared that careless words could lead to lies or gossip, violating the 9th commandment, which is "Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor." I also believe that they told their followers to be completely silent so that they wouldn't risk people asking questions and kind of becoming very suspect to the whole situation with the apocalypse. I mean, if your followers can't talk to each other and find out what the other is thinking, no one's going to question the leaders. So I think they did it for their own good, but follow your commandments, I suppose. So apart from the very creepy silence that was in the commune every day, fasting was also a very common practice. Members would only eat one meal on Fridays and one meal on Mondays. Other than that, nothing. They believed that the physical deprivation purified their soul, which prepared them for the final judgment during the whole apocalypse thing. Even basic hygiene like using soap was forbidden, as was any form of sexual activity, of course. These rules, though really extreme, reinforced the movement's message of rejecting worldly pleasures in favor of spiritual readiness. This sounds awful to me. I mean, can you imagine living in a community where you're not allowed to talk, you're not allowed to kiss someone, you're not allowed to bath or shower or use soap, so you stink all day, and you can only eat on Fridays and Mondays? How charismatic could leaders possibly be to make people do this kind of shit? I ask that question every day. But anyways, moving on. Judith, a hero, a former member of the cult, recounts that life rotated around prayer, although everyone also had self-sustaining farms, so they would spend most of their spare time also farming. She said that they did everything possible to avoid sin. Sometimes if you sinned, they would actually command you to recite the rosary, which is an entreaty to God, 1,000 times. She said that you had to do it, but you were allowed to ask friends or family to help you recite it to get all of the 1,000 done a little bit quicker. And only once you had served your punishment could you continue with life again. Devotion to the movement also regularly involved a pilgrimage to a steep rocky hill nearby. After a very tough hike through a forest, hanging onto rocks and grabbing tufts of grass to get over this hill, only the people faithful would reach a rock that they believed depicted the Virgin Mary. AIDS, which was also ravaging in Uganda at the time, was seen by the group as a divine punishment for adultery, which is obviously one of the violations of the Ten Commandments. This belief obviously gave the movement's teachings an air of urgency and moral superiority. People just thought that if they violated the sixth commandment, which is, I think, thou shalt not commit adultery, they would get AIDS. So the members just kind of believed that if they adhered to the commandments, it could shield them from God's wrath and ensure their survival. And not surprisingly, reports of child labor, mistreatment, and harsh punishments were a troubling part of life within the commune. Leaders ruled with an iron hand, enforcing very strict obedience through using fear and control. Members who spoke out or failed to follow the group's teachings were punished with either public humiliation, forced fasting, or physical isolation. And gee, these people are already fasting. I cannot imagine what the forced fasting must be like. Children in particular were also subjected to very harsh conditions. They were made to work very long hours in the group's fields, planting and harvesting crops that sustained the self-sufficient community. Education was limited. Like I said before, they closed the school down after a measles outbreak, and their lives revolved entirely around the movement's strict practices and apocalyptic teachings, much like the parents and adults. There were even accusations of kidnapping children, with some reports suggesting that minors were brought into the movement against their will. So for those within the movement, life was a daily struggle and a test of faith. These people were put under very oppressive rules that left very little room for individuality or freedom. Like I mentioned earlier, the apocalypse was a central theme in the group's teachings. Movement leaders declared that the end of the world would 100% occur on December 31st of 1999. Their booklet, called A Timely Message from Heaven, The End of the Present Time, became a very sacred text for members. New recruits were required to read it multiple times and commit its lessons to memory. The booklet painted the movement as a modern Noah's Ark, a righteous refuge in a world drowning in sin. The Virgin Mary, of course, played a key role in their apocalyptic vision, and this connection to the divine obviously added weight to their apocalyptic predictions and just kept followers obedient. The movement operated under a very strict hierarchy, with Credonia Marinda at the top as the chief visionary. Below her were a few former Catholic priests who served as theologians, and they would help interpret the messages that Credonia received from the Virgin Mary and reinforce all of the movement's teachings to its followers. Despite their split from the Catholic Church, the group maintained ties to Catholic symbols and lots of rituals. Icons of the Virgin Mary and Jesus were prominently displayed throughout the community, and the presence of defrocked priests and nuns in leadership obviously lent an air of legitimacy to the cause. However, their relationship with the church was definitely strained at best. As the year 2000 approached, the movement's activities became frantic. Leaders urged members to confess their sins, sell their belongings, and prepare for the end. Both clothing and cattle were sold at bargain prices, and lots of efforts were made to re-recruit former members who had left the group. The fields went untended as the community focused entirely on the coming apocalypse. The anticipation was palpable. People were chaotic. But when the 1st of January of 2000 came and went without incident, no apocalypse, no world ending, lots of cracks began to appear in the movement's foundation. People were asking questions and people were very disappointed. Followers who had sacrificed absolutely everything in preparation for the apocalypse started questioning their leaders. Credonia and Joseph obviously faced lots of growing pressures to explain to their followers why this prophecy had failed. At this point, donations to the movement completely stopped, and some members actually demanded their money back, having sold all they owned just completely to fund the group. So to maintain control and keep the money flowing, the leaders announced a new date for the apocalypse because, the old date failed, so, sorry, my mistake, there's a new one. And this date was March 17th of 2000. This time they absolutely promised that this was now the end, and it would come with a ceremony and complete finality. For the disillusioned followers who actually believed their leaders, this second prophecy was both a renewed hope and a desperate attempt to make sense of all of the sacrifices they had made. But obviously now the leaders have realized that people are starting to ask questions when prophecies fail, and they're starting to demand their money back. So they were now thinking of ways that they could maintain control and silence the people even further. So here comes the tragedy. The events of March 17th of 2000 shocked the world and left a very long trail of unanswered questions. What had begun as a seemingly joyous celebration among members of the MRTCG turned into a very horrifying tragedy. That fateful day that was supposed to be the end of the world, the group hosted a feast at their compound in Kanungu. The group ended their fast, slaughtered 3 bulls, and served over 70 crates of soft drinks, mostly Coca-Cola. Members arrived dressed in their finest clothes, believing that they were preparing for the end of the world. Minutes after members entered the church, I'm assuming that is where the celebration was held, an explosion rang out and the whole building erupted in flames. Witnesses from nearby villages reported seeing the church engulfed in a fire which burned with such ferocity that no one inside could escape. The windows and doors had actually been nailed shut to ensure that there was no way out for the people inside. A cult member who survived this event later recounted seeing a devout member of the cult carrying nails and a hammer as he left the compound, presumably to go nail the windows and doors shut. All 530 people who were inside the church at that time unfortunately perished, and it is said that their bodies were burned beyond recognition. Judith, a hero, one of the former cult members that I spoke about earlier, thankfully did not enter the church that day, but she recalled some of the events that happened. Unfortunately, her mother, 2 siblings, and 4 other relatives died in the fire. She recalls that everything was covered in smoke and soot, and she recalls smelling the stench of burnt flesh. She said that it seemed to just go right into your lungs. She recalls that everyone who was not inside the church was running into the valley, the fire was still going, and there were just dozens of bodies burnt beyond recognition. Apparently, people who survived were covering their noses with aromatic leaves to ward off the smell, and for several months after the events, they actually could not eat meat. Judith joined the movement with her family when she was only 10 years old, and her widowed mother was struggling to raise 3 children, one of whom suffered with persistent headaches. So Credonia's group obviously offered prayer and a sense of belonging, so without any second guesses, they joined the group. In the days that followed after the fire, investigators uncovered the true scale of this tragedy. Police determined that the fire had unfortunately been deliberately set, likely using sulfuric acid, which was purchased by Dominique Catarabibo, one of the group's leaders, just days before the event. What appeared at first to be a mass suicide now took on an even darker dimension as authorities searched other properties linked to the movement. Mass graves were eventually discovered all across southern Uganda, containing hundreds of additional bodies. At the Kanungu compound, 6 corpses were found in a latrine. At a site in Buhunaj, 153 bodies were unearthed. Another 155 bodies were discovered at Katarabambo's estate in Rugazi. Many of these corpses were showing signs of either poisoning or stabbing. An additional 81 bodies were found at Joseph's farm. Medical examiners determined that most of the victims had actually been poisoned, while earlier reports suggested that some of them had been strangled as banana fibers were found around their necks. These killings had occurred weeks and weeks before the church fire, which obviously raised doubts about the initial theory of a mass suicide event. In total, at least 778 people died, with some estimates placing the death toll as high as 924. This number actually surpasses the infamous People's Temple Massacre in Jonestown. Both the manner of death and the scale of the killings drew comparisons to other apocalyptic movements, which includes the Solar Temple in Switzerland and Aum Shinrikyo in Japan. Scholars and investigators eventually concluded that the tragedy was definitely not a mass suicide, but a coordinated mass murder orchestrated by the movement's leaders. Many believe that the failed doomsday prophecy of January 1st of 2000 caused an unrest among members, some of whom began to demand their money back. In response, the leaders obviously devised a new apocalyptic date, which was March 17th, and used it as an opportunity to eliminate their followers so that they wouldn't ask any more questions after the second end of the world. The Ugandan government responded with outrage. President Yoweri Museveni condemned the act as mass murder by these priests for monetary gain, while Vice President Speciosha Wandira Kazibwe called it a diabolic, well-orchestrated crime. Despite these strong words and the outrage, the investigation into the tragedy was unfortunately hampered by very limited forensic resources and alleged corruption. Like I said earlier, the whole country of Uganda was going through some stuff, and I guess just all of the problems that they were facing kind of stopped the investigators from doing their job. Autopsies were unfortunately not even performed on many of the victims, and the official commission of inquiry never convened. And the worst part about this entire thing is that the whereabouts of the movement's leaders remains a complete mystery up until this day. While some initially believed that both Joseph and Credonia and some of the other leaders perished in the fire, police now suspect that they actually escaped. International warrants were issued for their arrest, and in 2014, Ugandan National Police reported sightings of Joseph in Malawi. But nothing actually came from those sightings, and to this day, no one has been prosecuted in connection with the massacre. The scholarly response to this tragedy has also been quite limited. Some researchers, like anthropologist Richard Vokes, have challenged the official narrative. Vokes actually argued that the bodies found in all of the mass graves after the fire were not victims of the cult's killing, but actually instead casualties of a very severe malaria epidemic that happened years and years earlier. This theory is actually supported by discrepancies in the decomposition stages of the bodies and lack of proper forensic investigations. Like I said earlier, there were a lot of corpses that didn't have any autopsies performed, so it's pretty hard to say, how these people were killed. Although there was evidence of poisonings and strangling, there were lots of bodies that didn't have evidence of that, so yeah, he thought that it was probably because of the malaria outbreak. So today the Kanungu compound has been incorporated into a tea plantation, but its very dark history still lingers. The property owner has announced plans to create a memorial to honor the victims, because despite the scale of the Kanungu tragedy, the victims have never really been officially remembered. Families of the deceased are still waiting for answers to this day. Judith, the former cult member, says that she prays for her loved ones on her own and that she carries all of her pain in silence. It was also pointed out that the Kanungu cult definitely capitalized on the fears and struggles that all of the residents of Uganda were facing at that time. It was noted that this pattern persists in the teachings of today's self-proclaimed prophets, with scholars saying that the Jesus industry has become a business. Spiritual movements similar to the Kanungu cult continue to appear across Africa. These groups often have very devoted followers who believe that their leaders can perform miracles, such as resurrecting the dead or healing illnesses with holy water. Dr. Paddy Musana from Makerere University's Department of Religion and Peace Studies explains their appeal, He says that when people face hardships or unmet needs, whether from traditional faith or the government, someone claiming to have a solution can easily attract thousands of people looking for that solution. And there you have it. That is the really tragic story of the MRTCG, or the Movement for the Restoration of the 10 Commandments of God. Whew, that's a long name. But I find it really heartbreaking that these people literally capitalized on people's fears and uncertainty in the Ugandan country at that time. People were just going through so many awful things, and instead of genuinely helping the community and the people in their country, they thought, oh, let me make a quick buck out of these people. And I'm sure in the beginning it was never their plan to commit a mass murder, but that is what it ended up as. So many people died, and for what? I mean, all they gave away was their money, their belongings, and they genuinely got nothing good out of it. These people were starving themselves in very unhygienic conditions, not even talking to each other. I can imagine that emotionally these people were also completely deprived, and then they were just eventually murdered. I just can't imagine what it must have felt like for these people to finally have hope in some sort of salvation through Joseph and Credonia, and then to just be murdered from that. And I really hope that in my lifetime they catch both of the leaders, because they deserve to be in prison for a very, very long time. So yeah, let me know what you thought about this case in the comments down below. And if there are any other cases you would like me to cover, please don't hesitate to let me know, because I'm always looking for new cults to discover. I hope that you have an amazing week, and I hope that you have an amazing beginning of the year. If you have any goals or New Year's resolutions, hoy them in the comments as well. Maybe it will help keep you a little bit more accountable. I know it helps keep me accountable when I write them down or type them out to someone. But I hope that 2025 is the most beautiful, amazing, and full of blessings year for you. And I'm sending you all my love and all of my positive vibes for the new year. I love you lots, and I will see you in the next video.